No, that's what I was going to say. Everybody, we're on part 3 of a 5-part series, and I know you're going to love this video. I'm Richard Thomas.
And I'm Tiffany Thomas.
And welcome to the Lionheart Institute podcast. This one, we came off the heels of Black History Month, and we had to include slavery, which ended up being a long dialogue, and man, was there a lot that we covered.
Yeah, a lot to say, a lot of truth that needed to be told.
And so while this story is in the context of America and the journey to slavery in America, I think it's going to be a valuable one for you to dialogue, think about, digest with your family, and really help our current situation in America as we grow through some very challenging times. If
you haven't had a chance yet, why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button, click that bell to get the notifications of all of our videos. You don't want to miss out, especially on the next videos coming off this series. They are definitely worth the watch.
Right. But apparently it's also not appropriate for us to kneel.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate for us to sit. Mm-hmm. It's not appropriate for us to gather together and cry, right? And so the question becomes, what is the appropriate way? Mm-hmm. We look at the Star-Spangled Banner, Colin Kaepernick, for instance.
Yes.
And you have a whole society that was torn apart or torn over the topic, right? Mm-hmm. Viewership in the NFL plummeted as a result of it, right?
The hate
that gathered around it. I remember still being in a gym in Everett, and when Colin first refused to stand during the national anthem, just all hell breaking out.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, grown men fighting on the basketball court over whether or not he had the right to kneel. But what most people don't realize that there is a whole stanza that we don't, of course, sing today, right? But the song itself was founded in it. Share that a little bit, because I think it's important for Americans and our viewing audience to begin to understand that just because we see things at one perspective doesn't mean that there isn't a much broader, deeper, wider breadth of understanding to that topic, that if we investigate it, we begin to say, you know what, the lights come on a little bit. I can see from a new perspective, and when you can see from a new perspective, the truth of history begins to change. So roll that out a little bit.
So let's talk about the Star-Spangled Banner for a second. The author, Francis Scott Key, was an avowed white supremacist. Imagine that. He was quoted as saying that blacks were a distinct and inferior race of people, which experience proves to be the greatest evil that afflicts this community.
Tell it.
Now, this man wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. Now, for most people, I didn't know this, and again, ignorance, but there is 4 different stanzas in the Star-Spangled Banner.
4.
We only usually ever sing the first one, right? Sometimes we repeat it a couple times, but we only ever sing the first one. But in the third one, there is some lines that talk about slaves. And he wrote, "Their blood was washed out their foul footsteps population. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave."
The home of the free and the land of the brave, as long as you're Caucasian.
As long as you're white.
Right.
So, people, I really want you to take that in, because I want you to understand that this country's national anthem is about white supremacy. Period. It is about glorifying the home of the free and the brave for white people. Not for black slaves, not for anybody else, for white people. And I think that you need to put that into perspective, that we glorify an anthem that we hold dear, that we call everything patriotic in this country, that anthem that we stand and put our hands over our chests for, and we take our hats for, and we honor, was written about white supremacy. It was not written of the land of the free and the brave for everyone. So when Colin took a knee and we condemned him for being anti-patriotic, anti-military, anti-American, he was kneeling for a song that didn't include him, for an anthem that this country honors that didn't include him. I mean, think about that. We condemned a man for saying, hey, my life matters, for kneeling for a song that clearly said your life doesn't matter to us.
Yeah, tragically. Not to interrupt you, because I feel your passion. And I feel the truth of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Tragically, the reality, however, is that it's a much more complex truth than that.
Yeah.
When we look at it and we say, it did not include us,
Yeah.
or the Constitution of the United States did not include us, the beauty of it is that it also makes room for us.
Yes.
It also, the beauty of it is that we have the capacity, which most sane people have done, to take the third stanza out of the song. Never would we sing that.
Right.
I couldn't imagine being at a baseball game and them singing that song.
Right.
I couldn't imagine us being at a kickoff for a high school game and them singing that song. Right? I couldn't imagine being at a political event, although I've seen some wild stuff happen of late in our parties that needs addressing, where they would outright say, we support white supremacy, that God is for the white man, right?
Yes.
However, I have heard some crazy dialogue like stand back and stand ready or stand
by.
Stand whatever the word is, right? So we look at that and we say, hey, truth is the Star-Spangled Banner wasn't intended for us.
Yeah.
But more black people have died for this country than I could begin to imagine.
Absolutely.
More people of color have fought in our world wars and in our military than I could ever imagine.
Yeah.
Okay? More black blood has been spilled for this country than I could ever begin to imagine.
Yeah.
So hell with you giving me permission.
Yeah.
This is my country.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I say that to say, right? And as much anger and as much passion as we feel as we begin to learn the truth, we also have to understand that we're in charge of the truth.
Yeah.
And what that truth begins to become in our lives, right? That there's this whole mindset about reparations.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And I'm going to build on this a little bit because I think it's important that we begin to understand this.
Yeah.
There's this whole mindset about reparations for slavery, that we should get our 40 acres and a mule. And there's this whole outcry that reparations was never paid. However, just in a short amount of research, you can find out that that's actually not true.
Right.
Right? So unfold that a little bit so I can continue on my high horse with this.
Right. So interesting enough, reparations were paid to white people.
Tell it.
Oh my goodness. So white slave owners were paid $300 for each slave they freed after the Civil War.
Now, it's interesting. Free meant bring down the block and put into sharecropping, but
right. Now, out of the 4 million black slaves in America at the time of the end of the Civil War, 3,000 slaves were freed at that time. And about $1 million was paid to white slave owners for the loss of their property by the Lincoln administration.
And so we talk about reparations. It'd be interesting if you were to take $1 million, and there's no reason for us to do the work. This is part of self-education.
Right.
Take $1 million in the days of the Civil War ending. Yep. All of a sudden, the slaves are free. These slave owners have lost their property.
Yeah.
Take $1 million in what it was worth then. Go ahead and do the research yourself. And find out what that $1 million is worth today.
Yep.
And then you will begin to discover where a high percentage of Southern wealth was created.
Yeah.
And it'll be mind-boggling to you, I'm sure, if you begin to understand that if we were in a 4-lap race and we were considering a finish line, which of course there is no true finish line other than death, right? But we were considering a finish line, why it is that African Americans or black people are at such a disadvantage in this race, right? Because if you were to take $1 million from pre-Civil War and begin to compare that $1 million to today, where the economic gap would really be, right? And so I say that to say, give me my 40 acres and a mule.
Right.
Because anywhere that African Americans have been on a level playing field, not even a level playing field, anywhere that African Americans have been able to just run their race, they've been able to find a way to become victorious. Now, I'm not saying that they're better than, I'm not saying that they're more skilled than, I'm not saying that they're hungrier than, but if you allow an African American to race against anyone, skills, education, all those things being equal, that reparations makes a difference.
Right. It absolutely does. 100%.
So here we are in a world where, of course, my viewing audience knows. Been married twice. Both of them happen to be of lighter perception or melatonin, whatever we call it, right? However, you look at the tragic reality of obviously white males in the role of slavery, racism, white supremacy in America, right? And this was even shocking to me as I began to go through this research.
Right.
Because we were always, in some ways, taught that the white woman was a victim of the society of slavery just as equally as were African Americans. However, as you begin to scratch the surface of this reality, sure, the lower class who didn't own slaves, they were probably more dominantly affected, even as equally affected in some ways. But when you begin to talk about the upper echelons of the slave society where white women were given access, talk a little bit about that portion of society where white women actually owned slaves.
So I'm not going to lie, this took me by surprise. And I was doing research for us to be able to do this video for all of you. And I literally had to pause. And I remember texting Richard, I'm like, hey, I'm going to need some more time because I just found some stuff that I don't even know how to wrap my brain around right now.
Sure.
And it was the role white women played in slavery. And it was shocking. So, we have always been taught, especially during that period, that white women couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, and technically they belonged to their husbands or their fathers before they were married.
Sure.
Almost treated like property as well. So I think growing up, we looked at the mistreatment of women very similar to the mistreatment of black people in America, right? We kind of came together.
You saw them as victims.
The suffrage, women's suffrage, right? We were all victims. We all suffered at the hands of white men and society. But there was a lot of mistruths in that. And it was specifically kept out of history for a very, very particular reason. But the truth is that even though women had very little rights back then, imagine this, they could actually own slaves.
Couldn't own property.
They couldn't own property.
Couldn't own horses.
Couldn't own anything else. Couldn't vote. Couldn't do anything, but they could own slaves.
Tell it now.
Now, by 1850, white women actually made up over 40% of slave owners.
It's crazy.
Which is really significant. Now, George Washington, our very first president of the United States, owned 18 slaves. Now, when he married Martha, Martha brought into their marriage almost 100 slaves that she personally owned. Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Changes the world you live in, doesn't it?
Now, typically, this is where it gets interesting. So typically women were gifted enslaved people as gifts. So for birthday gifts or christening gifts or when they got married, their dowry were slaves. So women were often gifted people far more than they were ever gifted land or property. Now, the reason why this became so significant is because this became ingrained as part of white women's identities in the South especially. They became attached to wanting to own more and more slaves because essentially that was their freedom. That was their
position in society.
Yes, their identity was in how many slaves they could own and control. And it also made them a better prospect for marriage. So the more slaves they owned, the more they could bring to the marriage, the higher, position they could have on the marriage block. So that was significant because slavery essentially became a form of freedom.
Generational wealth.
Yeah, for white women is why that's really prevalent. Now, what a lot of people don't know is white women became very prevalent and active and often violent participants in the slave markets. And most people, you couldn't buy land, but you could go to the slave market as a woman. They bought, they sold, they managed, and very significantly, they were aggressively active participants in retrieving runaway slaves. And they, in fact,
creating the police state.
Yes, essentially, white women created the groups that are now police officers, but that were in charge of retrieving slaves because they didn't want to lose their slaves. They didn't want to lose their wealth and their position, so they wanted to make sure their slaves came back.
And so a lot of people in today's world, they would see that and they would begin to say that that's where the real beginning of the police nation began, right? Mm-hmm. The way that policing is conducted today, the way that it is prevalent in minority communities, right. The way that things happen, that it began really from white women going to retrieve their property or runaway slaves, right?
Yes, absolutely. That was really important to them because if they lost a slave, that was potential economic stability for them, along with their own personal freedom and status. And so they were not willing to lose any slaves. Now, white women often held more female slaves than males. And this is actually really interesting, and I didn't know that this happened. But so in slave markets, oftentimes male slave owners didn't want to buy children, women that had children.
Which is one of the points that make American slavery so unique in world history.
Yeah.
Is that you didn't receive slaves as a family.
Right.
You didn't keep family units together. Oftentimes, you would receive slaves individually ripped apart from their families, right? And so that's one of the most devastating truths about American slavery is that they're ripping apart. However, now you have, with the rise of white women slave owners, you have this whole new demographic of purchasing slaves that begins.
Right. So, interesting enough, white male slave owners actually saw it as a liability to have children that came with the women that they bought. So they didn't take the children. They would just buy the women, and the children would be left at the slave auction.
And they would just be left there to wander.
They would just be left, literally, just abandoned. Because, especially if they're small children, I believe age 10 was the kind of the age that they deemed that black children could start working in the fields.
Morally okay.
Right, it was okay. So anybody under the age of 10 were literally just abandoned because nobody wanted them. So the men saw them as liabilities. They didn't want to take the children. Well, white women saw children as assets. And so they saw them as an investment.
And of course, by this time in history, London, England has begun to cut off slave trading. Right. It's now been said that you can't transport slaves from Africa. Right. And so now the slaves that are going to be here in America are already here. Right. Okay.
Right. So women definitely saw these children as a huge investment. They just had to wait a handful of years, and they would be definitely worth it because, interesting enough, they didn't have to pay for the children. So what white women would do is they would wait for the slave auctions to be over, and any children that weren't taken with their mothers or parents that were left, they actually just were able to take for free. So they would just collect all these black children that were left, and now they had an investment. In a decade, it'd pay off, and they would start making money off them. And so that became a huge market for white women. They focused a lot on women and children. And, obviously because the women could bear children and produce more slaves. So that was something that white women very much focused on. They also actually created the market for black wet nurses. And this was really significant because white women did not want to nurse their own babies. Now, of course, I'm not saying this is with every woman, but they felt that they did not want to be slaves to their babies. And so they didn't want to nurse them. So they would go around the plantation, see if there was a black woman that just recently had a child, and then they would make them wet nurses. Now, where this is a very tragic story and situation because
heartbreaking.
Black women were not allowed to nurse their own children if they were nursing a white child. And again, I encourage you to look up stories, read stuff, because it's heartbreaking to listen to stories of former slaves that were told, and the agony of watching their children starve to death while they had to nurse these white babies. And as a mother of 3, I can't even begin to imagine that pain of watching my own child starve to death because I had to nurse a white child. Like, I just can't even. It's just so horrific that white women were evil enough to literally have no issue with that.
And it's not in the days of pump and dump.
Right, right. So this actually, and it goes even further than this. And when I use the word evil because I don't know how to put words on what these people did. And so not only did they take these black slaves as nursemaids for their babies, but women that were pregnant, white women, as soon as they found out they were pregnant, they would oftentimes set up rape of a black slave so that way she would become pregnant. That way she would give birth around the same time as her child. That way she could use her as a nursemaid.
It's heartbreaking.
I mean, it's just unbelievable that they would go to that extent to, one, cause that kind of violence against these women and then allow their babies to die in the process so that way they could have a nursemaid. Right. I mean, it's just horrific. And it's crazy. But white women's role in slavery was significant too because they taught their children. They were the ones indoctrinating their children at a very young age on how to run slave households, how to treat their slaves. And obviously the men, as they grew up, especially the sons, they take them in the fields and they would show them as they grew up. But when they were young, their first knowledge and indoctrination came from the moms. And they taught them how to treat slaves, how to sell them, how to buy them, how to beat them, how to, tend to them. And it's really interesting because I found this out and it broke my heart. But there was actually a law that had to be put in place because the white wives, the wives of the plantation owners, would often beat the children of their husbands and slaves to death out of just anger, out of resentment, that any, mixed babies that they saw, they would beat them to death and use them just as punching bags, kicking bags. They would treat them so horribly till they would die. And they actually had to put a law to prevent white women from killing these children.
It's heartbreaking.
It's just, there's just no words for it. There was also, we hear a lot of talk of rape of the female black slaves, of course, by the masters and their sons and the men who worked with them.
They're overseers.
But there is a lot of untalked about stories of the white women and the rape of their slaves as well. And sexual relationships between white women and slaves were not very common early on. Mm-hmm. However, because it was actually forbidden for a white woman to have a sexual relationship with the black slave. And but this
crazy that they would have to note that.
Yes, they would have to note that. And interesting enough, in the 1800s, a little thing called abortion was created so white women could take advantage of their slaves. And abortion was used to abort black slave children. And that way that there wouldn't be caught, because there was severe consequences, obviously, with, the husbands and the men. Everybody knew those were their kids, but they didn't have to claim them. Right. But obviously a white woman giving birth to a black child was a lot more significant. Obviously, you can't really hide that. So that's what, so when abortion came into play, then of course the sexual desires and needs of white women grew astronomically when it came to the black slaves.
It's heartbreaking.
So sexual relationships grew to a much higher rate and actually very comparable to white men. And then, of course, this allowed white women to further their dominance and control over their slaves as well. Oftentimes, white women would threaten the black slave men that they would claim rape if they didn't have sex with them, that they would beat them. They, would force them into these situations, giving them no options if they didn't comply with their wishes and their desires. If they didn't.
And tragically, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but tragically, we see many of the same heartbreaking tendencies in the world that we live in today.
Right.
And I'm certainly not pointing a finger that all rapes are not real.
Yeah.
But there were a ton of them then, and there are a ton of them now that are false accusations that when we begin to study the truth and we begin to reveal the truth, mm-hmm. the reality of them would begin to lessen because we would be in a state of truth.
Yeah.
And people wouldn't feel that shame and that hiding.
Right.
And we could step away from that bondage, right?
Right. The sad truth is, and, as a white woman, I am appalled and beyond words at the history of our behavior. And, white women had such a significant role in the violence that happened against slaves and the control. And, the truth is it was covered up because it did not fit the narrative of the good, wholesome, God-fearing Christian white woman.
Tell it.
And they had to maintain that purity, and so this history of the participation. I mean, the truth is white women actually fought harder to keep slavery than the white men did. They had more to lose by losing slaves. And I mean, the Confederacy really was started by white women. So, learn the history. It's pretty significant of the role that they played. Especially look up Georgia's history. There's a huge history there of white women and white supremacy in the Confederacy. But, they wanted to lie and cover up a dark history of women because we had to maintain this good Christian, wholesome wife, mother, family, this image that they didn't want tarnished by the truth.
Right.
And I want to read a little story because I read this and I was heartbroken and tears flowed as I read it. And I'm warning you, it's really graphic, but I want you to hear this because to understand the truth, you have to emotionally connect with it. You have to understand the emotions, the feelings that come from this. And so I want you to hear this so that maybe you could understand a little bit more. Now, this was a story of a woman in New Orleans, a very prominent white slave owner. And this is what it says. It says, one woman kept the enslaved people she owned in a constant state of near starvation and would tempt a young enslaved girl who cleaned her bedroom by leaving a piece of candy on her dresser each day. One day, the enslaved girl yielded to her temptation and ate the candy. When the slave-owning woman discovered the candy missing, she accused the young girl of stealing it and proceeded to punish her by placing her head on the floor beneath the curved portion of her rocking chair. This woman then summoned her very young daughter to help her punish the enslaved girl. While she rocked back and forth on the young enslaved girl's head, her daughter whipped her. When they finished punishing the enslaved girl, she was irreparably disfigured. She was never able to eat solid foods again because her jaw would constantly slide to one side of her face. When she reached adulthood, her teeth never grew on that side either. Each time she was in her mistress's presence, her mistress was daily reminded of her cruelty, and it became so overwhelming that her mistress gave her to a relative so she would no longer have to look at her. There's just no words. There's just no words how people could treat people. A child like that and see nothing wrong with that and teach their children that it's acceptable to treat another human being this way. That she wouldn't look at her as she was a human being, that she tortured this child. I mean, what kind of person does that? And this is one of thousands of stories like this. One of thousands of stories.
Tiffany. Oh, part 3, girl. I have my heart ready to explode.
Right?
The passion, the fire, the reality of slavery in America.
Yeah.
There's a lot to digest.
It's definitely a lot. Truth is hard.
Yeah.
We have been told so little of genuine truth that it's hard when we're slapped in the face with it.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's time for our eyes to be open. It's time for us to open our hearts and our minds and really take in where our history is founded and where we come from as a people, as a country. And I think without that, we will never achieve true change in this country, because you cannot learn from a past that you don't know anything about.
So good. Right there, truth is at your fingertips. All you got to do is go get it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it will empower you. So that was a powerful part 3.
Yep, make sure you come back for part 4.
It's getting better and better, as they would say, gooder and gooder.
You're right.
And I think that it's going to be revolutionary by the time it's all said and done. So please do like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe. Share this with friends and family members so we can have some meaningful, impactful teaching around this topic that hopefully will change the world. Now, we don't know if it's going to have the impact of Roots. Man, did that impact our world, right? But we hope that it'll have an impact in your world and the way that you see things, so that we can bring about a better America and a better life for you to live in.
Absolutely. Stick around. We'll see you in part 4.